Hello, inmates, and welcome to the cellblock Scorch week 244A. This is Bones, and I'm recording as the winner of this week's Scorch. This week's prompt was given by Red, and it was, "It's a lonely climb from the village up to the god's palace, but as the only person who's ever come back, it's your job to continue to deliver the packages to the gods who live above the clouds. Except for the reason you've always come back is that you've never gone to the top." And this is a pretty long and specific prompt, so I feel like my thoughts on it will give away a lot of what I'm going to do with the piece. So I'm just going to jump right into the reading and give you my thoughts afterwards. This Scorch is called The Climb. The first time, it hadn't been an honor. Oh, everyone pretended it was. Everyone had always pretended being chosen as the messenger to the gods was the highest honor one could receive, instead of an indication that the village elders thought you were the least valuable adult member of society. Expendable. Lacking attachments that would make others speak up and possibly riot when you didn't return from that journey. She lived in a little hut in the woods, just close enough to the village to claim the security of a group and just far enough away that everyone could pretend otherwise. Her single father had been chosen to make the journey when she was only 7, and she suspected that the villagers liked to pretend the result of that choice wasn't living next door. Offerings to the gods were made every year on the same day, preceded by an entire week of celebrations in which the person chosen would be showered in every luxury the village could afford, as if that made giving up their lives acceptable. That first year, the year she turned 21 and was officially recognized as an adult in the village, if there had been anyone to acknowledge it at least, she heard the procession of drums and forced cheer moving through the village as always. They were heading towards the home of whatever poor soul had been chosen, and gathering villagers relieved at their own continued existence along the way. And the procession was getting louder. She had assumed that no one had noticed she was now an adult. She had been wrong. At the end of a week of pity and relief thinly veiled by hollow congratulations, they had shoved a basket of the finest foods, clothes, and decorations into her arms and waved her off up the mountain path. And she walked, because what else could she possibly do? It was a long climb to the god's home, the mountain stretching above the clouds, and the cheers of the villagers faded quickly. She suspected it was less due to the speed at which she was climbing and more to their lack of interest in her fate. And the longer she climbed in the solitude of nature, the longer she had to think. Thinking of the way the village dropped food off at her doorstep and ran from her questions when she began living alone at the tender age of 7. Thinking of the bare minimum she was given to survive on, thin blankets through the cold winters, and just enough food to always have a rumbling in her stomach as she grew. Thinking of the gods, and how none of them had ever done her any favors. Thinking of the luxurious way she'd been treated these past 6 days, as if that erased everything else. Thinking of the luxuries in the offering basket, given to gods who had never cared, and taken from children who grew not to. Thinking that, even though her life had never been luxurious, it had been good. Thinking of the last day her father had been with her, how he told her that she deserved to live and love, and that he loved her so, so much, and at the time she hadn't understood why he was saying it. Thinking that she wanted to live. She wanted to return to that old house her father had built with the mother she couldn't remember, both of them laboring for hours to craft a home she could thrive in. And in the end, wasn't it stupid? Wasn't it just so stupid that those people down in the village who had never done anything more than the bare minimum to avoid her premature death so they could send her off to die in a way they wouldn't feel guilty about, a way that benefited only them? Wouldn't it be so stupid for her to die for their sake? She supposed the gods had never struck someone down before, and, to be honest, if she was the first, that would be a glorious legacy to leave. The gods couldn't take her father from her and then expect her to follow their will blindly. So she turned around a bend completely out of sight of the village and all its people, only about a fifth of the way up the mountain, and walked straight into the trees instead of continuing the ascent. It wasn't hard to stay in the woods for 3 days, not with the ample offerings and her own experience making scarce food stretch. When the food had run out, she decided that was long enough. Leaving the ornate box and the non-perishable items inside it covered half-heartedly off the path. Someone stumbling across it would be highly unlikely, since the whole mountain was considered holy ground. She headed back down. Fortunately, I can't say, and I don't remember, and it was beyond description, are all perfectly reasonable answers as to what the god's home was like and how she had returned alive. And since in the following months there was no smiting or striking down, everyone was forced to concede that she had completed her duty, and she simply must have been chosen by the gods to be their permanent offering bearer. Which was why, the next year, the procession stopped at her house yet again. And again, she walked a fifth of the way up the mountain, stepped off the path, had a nice little picnic for a few days, and came back down. 6 months later, she was confronted with an irate 10-year-old. "Hey, you!" he screeched when he spotted her from across the street, and then he was bolting forwards with reckless abandon. The others on the street looked worried at the occurrence, but not nearly surprised enough. They stepped forward to place themselves between her and the charging child, and he managed to slither past several, but the baker finally snagged the back of his shirt, and she dangled him seemingly without inconvenience. Immediately, the others on the street placed themselves between her and the child, all bright smiles and placating words about how she needn't worry, that it was nothing. But although she didn't recognize the child, she had a dreadful, niggling feeling that she knew who he was. Ignoring the throngs trying to dissuade her, made easier because none dared bump her for fear of incurring the god's wrath, she stepped forward until she was face to face with the suspended child, still twisting irritably. He was small for his age, skinny and sallow and looking even worse than she had at that time in her life. "Did you want something, kid?" she asked, although the closer she looked, the sicker she felt. "My name is Zika," he declared, and the anger in his voice was familiar. "And I hate you." "He doesn't mean it, Kolpa," one of the men simpered, the calling of the ceremonial title and the way his eyes flicked to the mountain, telling her what he was really concerned about. "He's just an angry kid." An angry kid. Her eyes flicked to the mountain as well. "I do mean it," he snarled, finally managing to twist so the baker's grip faltered, landing on the ground with a stumble. He sent her one more venomous look upon recovery before darting back through the crowd, this time unimpeded as all the adults rushed to assure her that she had done nothing wrong and they would discipline the child. "Don't bother," she waved off with all the cold affectation being a messenger of the gods entailed. "He's simply a child." And she left, deliberately dismissing all attempts to engage. They hadn't had time for her when she wasn't the Kolpa, and she certainly didn't have time for them now that she was. After that, she began noticing him more, always in quick glimpses, rushed away with his mouth covered by adults. She wondered how long that kid had been trying to have it out with her, how many times he'd been thwarted by the adults who feared the gods more than they loved the village children. She wondered why it was that she, who had been left alone due to the selection, hadn't thought to seek out the others. It wasn't his fault, but everyone else's. Even she held some blame for his circumstances. The first time he visited her house, she didn't see him. But she knew it was him because no one else would be foolish enough to throw rotted food at the Kolpa's house. If anyone found out, he may well have been expelled from the village, which was a death sentence to a child so young. Luckily, she had long ago made it clear that she wanted to be left alone, save for the week leading to the offering. So she simply cleaned the place up and didn't mention it. The second time, she was home when he began pelting. The kid had a good arm, despite his malnutrition and small stature. She found it in herself to be grateful, at least, that he wasn't eating the rotted stuff he was using to bombard her house. When the thudding died down, she opened the window, intending to lament loudly about the surplus of food she had and her intention to perhaps leave some in a basket at the edge of her clearing for whatever animals may wish it. And a rancid tomato splatted directly on her face and into her open mouth. She couldn't help but sputter out an astonished laugh at the gall of it all, spotting just a flash of the kid bolting off into the trees. The first time she left out food for the kid, he had stared at the basket for several hours before making any sort of move. In fact, he had waited until she left, carefully not looking in his direction, and when she returned, the basket and food were both gone. He had still smashed rotten veggies all over her door. To her surprise, the basket had been returned to her doorstep the next day, filled with dirt and other mess, clearly a deliberate slight to her offering, even though he had taken it, but returned nonetheless. They continued like that. She left food, he left a mess. He returned the basket in good condition, but filled with unsavory things like bugs and trash. She left food. He took it faster. He left less of a mess. The basket was returned in good condition, with steadily less nasty things inside of it. The week of the celebration of her third ascent up the mountain, Zika was nowhere to be seen, and no one would answer her questions as to where he had gone, simply assuring her that he would not interrupt the celebrations and not to worry about it. As much as they scrambled to please her, not one had a moment to spare to understand that she wanted him here. He also wasn't there to welcome her back with the remainder of the village when she returned on the third day. Although she couldn't say she was too surprised, he had become less overtly aggressive over the last 6 months, but she wouldn't venture to say he had come to like her. More that he had realized she was helpful and was treating her accordingly. Still, she wouldn't lie to herself and say she wasn't disappointed. The clamor of people she didn't like rushing to check superficially on her well-being died down to the silence of solitude, a sound she had grown to hate nearly as much. The shadows of the trees grew long under the setting sun, and she kept her eyes down to the ground as she trudged through the fallen pine needles. She would return to an empty house, as always. Only when she came into sight of her solitary cabin, her head snapped up as she caught a movement in her peripheral vision. She wasn't fast enough to dodge, and she was hit smack in the chest by a fruit even more rotted than usual. And was it strange that she was hoping it was because he had been waiting for her to return with it these last 3 days? Someone waiting to pelt her with rotten food. That was what caused the bubble of lightness to well in her constricted chest. "Zika!" She smiled, not even hesitating at the nasty glop on her shirt. "You're so stupid!" the kid seethed, and even though she couldn't see his face in the falling darkness, she knew the choked sound of tears that the anger only accentuated. "That mountain kills everything that goes up it, and you go there every year, and you come back just fine. Why is it you, anyway?" He ranted, and she couldn't tell if he was mad that she had come back or that she'd had to leave in the first place. He grabbed the basket of rotting vegetables. He'd brought them in her basket, the one she'd left for him full of food before she left on her journey, and started stomping away without waiting for a response. The lightness had disappeared, and somehow she felt emptier than she had in years. Zika had always hated her on principle, but she hadn't quite thought he'd really wanted her dead. Not after they'd begun to have this strange report. The possibility was sobering. "Do you want me to disappear?" she asked to the ground, not expecting him to hear or bother to answer if he did, but his stomping footsteps ceased immediately. If he said yes, perhaps the result of the journey would be different next year. "No, yes, no," he shouted, taking a step back towards her, aborting halfway through and wavering awkwardly. "I like you," he spat like it was a curse. "I'm glad the mountain... But why is it you?" His voice, strong with anger, wobbled and faltered as he continued. "If someone could come back, why is it... Why wasn't it?" He didn't finish, and she could hear him sobbing now. The worst part was that she knew exactly why. The answer was that his mother was a strong woman, a good person, who had put the well-being of the village above herself. She had taken on an impossible duty with horrendous consequences, and she had fulfilled it. And even if that meant leaving Zika alone, she couldn't bring herself to hate his mother for it. Because she couldn't hate her father for it either. But she had taken the coward's way to save her own life. She had taken the martyr's way to become beloved in the village. She had taken the villain's way, the spiteful way, as a nearly silent part of her hoped that the village would suffer for her indiscretion. She had taken the tyrant's way, when she learned that there would be no consequences, but those consequences were so feared that none in the village would oppose her. Zika had dropped the basket, sending rotted food rolling on the ground. But he remained standing tall, clenching his fists and pretending valiantly not to be trembling with the effort of suppressing his sobs. Zika took after his mother, she was sure. Nothing like the current Kolpa, whose name no one remembered, who had let down her father's legacy without a thought. If given the chance, when he came of age, she was sure Zika would take the basket of offerings and march up the mountain, demanding of gods, animals, and anything else he found on the way the meaning of his labor and the location of his mother. She had left her father to whatever fate had befallen him, and she had no intention of searching further. She had taken the route of forgetting, leaving behind even the name he had given her, a name no one had spoken in 16 years. But this wasn't the time for cowardice, or spite, or revenge. This was a child who was facing a lonely climb from the village to the home of the gods. A journey she had made alone. A journey she had abandoned. "Zika," she whispered as she drew close, and didn't even have time to ask if she could touch him before he flung himself into her arms and they sunk to the ground. Zika sobbing, and her feeling the burn of tears behind her eyes for the first time in years. Later, she decided, she would tell this child her name. She would invite him to live with her instead of in the husk of his old home. And she would teach him to see a beauty and love in the world that she had long forgotten. The road to the gods was long and solitary, and a journey she would never complete. The road ahead of Zika was unending and treacherous, but she was determined he would not face it alone.
This is Red, and I was the judge for week 244A of the cellblock Scorch. I'm not going to read you the prompt again because it's super long, and I'm sure you've heard it like at least twice in this episode. Anyways, I got this prompt the same way I get all of my prompts, in recent times at least. I go to a random word generator and I just click, refresh a couple of times, basically, so it spits out different words until I get a prompt in my little brain. For this Scorch, I received 2 entries, I'm pretty sure. One from Bones, who won, and one from Cricket. Both of them were really good. I think what really made the biggest difference is that I wrote this prompt with an intention of disobedience, whoever is climbing this mountain isn't doing their job. And I think that Cricket's piece was very much alike. They're doing what they're supposed to. They're just not going above and beyond. And it was a nice piece. It's kind of strangely feel-goody, but Bones really hit the nail on the head with horrible little village who sends people up the mountain every year to just disappear forever. But yeah, that's basically it. I really loved Bones' characters, and the motivation of the main character, whose name I do not remember, but she's super cool. I really like the natural progression of her rebellion from just going up the mountain by herself into an implied full separation from the village she's a part of with her little coven of children. So yeah, there you go.
And that's all, folks. Okay, so I loved this prompt immediately because I love crime and slighting the gods. And this whole prompt was clearly about someone who was like, hey, people seem to die when they give offerings to the gods, and that ain't gonna be me. So they don't do their job, and they are rewarded with living because of it. So, first of all, I have no idea what the actual gods situation is here. There's clearly something on that mountain, since no one who goes up returns. Could be gods and people die in their presence, or it could be gods and people who give them gifts are allowed to live in Elysian peace. Maybe if our Culpa had gone up, she would have been reunited with her dad. If it is gods, they clearly don't care much about the offerings, since they haven't been enforcing it since they haven't gotten any the last few years. Maybe the mountain simply is too high to survive the climb, and a combination of thin air and low temperatures will kill anyone who tries. Or a terrible monster or savage animals who eat the people who try to pass through, perhaps. I know just about as much as the main character, and she's never spared it a second thought since she decided not to go up the first time. Zika would go. One day he probably will. He's the type who wants to learn the truth even if it gets him killed. And he would demand to go up with her one day, but I do not know what he would find. So far this is a standalone work, but I actually do have some other ideas for it that I may write one day if the mood strikes me, because I didn't actually get to everything I wanted to write in this. My initial concept actually was that this person who was chosen to bring offerings to the gods was given a baby to bring up there to sacrifice, and they were like, hell no? We are not sacrificing children to the gods? So they just pretended to give the kid up and then blatantly lied about, having a kid or something. And that's where this universe is going eventually. Our Lady Protag has this whole realization because of this village kid, Tsika, and she ends up declaring it's her personal job to go and make sure all the kids who are left without parents because of the sacrifices are taken care of. And she ends up with just like a bunch of kids around. And then after that, the sending up the child happens. And since she already has a ton of kids who aren't biologically hers, it makes it a lot easier to just hide that one for a while and pretend they've always been there. But yeah, this piece was approaching 3,000 words, and I did not have enough room to get into all that. The only problem with writing more is that if I focus on anyone other than our girl, I'd have to figure out what's on the mountain that stops people from returning. So, who knows? One day I may decide. But I'm really happy with how this turned out. There are several lines I felt were really raw and got across the feelings I wanted to convey. Very rage against the gods and societal unfairness and different people's responses to trauma. So, I hope you all enjoyed it as well. The prompt I gave for week 245A was, I could take you. This isn't a boast, it's a burn. And I just love the type of characters who would say this, or convey this, basically. To clarify what I mean by this statement is that it's said by a weak character, you know? This isn't a boast. I could take you isn't a boast because it's not someone saying that they're strong. It's a burn because it's someone weak or otherwise non-threatening saying that whoever they're speaking to would lose an altercation despite their own admitted weakness. So I prompted it to see what kind of sassy, underpowered characters my fellow Scorchers could come up with. So look forward to experiencing that Scorch. And yeah, that's pretty much all I had. Thank y'all for listening. Check out the Patreon for some free bonus content and think about supporting us on there and reading all of our embers as well. They're quite thrilling, if I do say so myself. We appreciate all of you, and keep that fire burning. The Cellblock Scorch is a production of Stellacore, an independent group of nerds sharing their obsessions with the world. Links to all our projects, including Instagram, Tumblr, YouTube, Patreon, and Ko-Fi, can be found on our Linktree, posted in each episode description. Follow us on Tumblr or Instagram to see the prompt of the day before the episode drops, and a quote from each Scorch the day after. If you would like to support our creative endeavors, you can give a one-time tip to the Ko-Fi of the writer of your favorite Scorches, or check out our Patreon. There, you can access the Scorches and episode transcripts for free, or sign up for Spark level support for $5 a month to gain access to our embers as well.